Is there anything that they missed? Is there anything that they should have done differently? And maybe we'll get an answer to that question if and when, and it looks like it'll be pretty soon when we get the list from the Archdiocese that it looks like they're getting ready to reveal.
As the Archdiocese of New Orleans begins the long process of preparing to release a list of credible claims of sexual abuse by clergy, there are questions about how that process will play out. Good evening, I'm Natalie Shepard.
And I'm Ton Trung in for Karen Swenson. There also are questions about what responsibility the church has in reporting older, credible claims to authorities. Danny Monteverdi brings us the report.
During a recent interview with Eyewitness News, New Orleans Archbishop Gregory Aymond said a small number of new allegations of sexual abuse by members of the clergy have come across his desk.
I've also seen people who had not reported before that they had been abused, and they're coming forth now.
Single digits, double digits, or?
It would be single digits.
Okay. During that interview, Aymond said the Archdiocese had not had any credible complaints of sexual abuse in the last decade. That as the Catholic Church's sex abuse scandal makes headlines nationally and locally. The most recent news came Thursday with the feds issuing subpoenas to at least 7 dioceses in Pennsylvania. Now, Aymond and other bishops across Louisiana are preparing to release lists of credible claims of sexual abuse against priests. As new victims come forward, there are questions about how the local church determines what is or is not credible. A state law that went into effect in 2013 classifies people such as members of the clergy as mandated reporters. That means they must report claims of child abuse to law enforcement. During that recent interview with Eyewitness News, Aymond made it clear that the Archdiocese follows that law for new cases.
If there was one, we would immediately report it to the police, and they would do their investigation. We would also do our investigation, put those two together in order to come to a conclusion.
But how will the Archdiocese handle allegations of sexual abuse that predate the mandatory reporting law? An Archdiocese spokeswoman on Friday issued a statement that reads in part, "Our policy states if an adult comes to us alleging he or she was abused as a minor, we investigate and strongly encourage him or her to go to the authorities with the allegation." Eyewitness News legal analyst Chick Foray says it appears that policy lines up with state law.
But the issue is, what is the practical application of those policies and procedures, and did anything slip through the cracks?
Danny Monteverdi, Eyewitness News.
Penalties for any mandated reporter who fails to give authorities information about abuse of a minor include fines and up to 3 years in jail.